If you survived the lengthy ordeal that was part one of this video, then congratulations. You're now in a much better position to understand why these books that I'm going to recommend are useful and which ones might be right for you depending on your current level of knowledge and your musical goals. I should point out before we get into this that all of these books have pros and cons. There is no one book that covers every single area that I'm interested in the right amount of detail or in the right way. I'm also aware that there are hundreds and hundreds of theory and harmony books out there on the market, and I'm only going to recommend 5 or so. These are the ones that have been helpful to me. These are the ones that I know about. There might be other great ones which I don't know about and I haven't read. So if there's a title that you are particularly passionate about that's really had a big impact on your musical development, then let me know about it and I'll check it out. Book 1 is actually a series of books. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts, the basics of music, the fundamentals of melody, harmony and rhythm. And the way that I got into those and the way that I would advocate getting to those is actually classical music education, for better or worse. So this is book 1 on the list, the A-B Guide to Music Theory, part 1 by Eric Taylor. So the A-B here refers to the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music, who are the governing body of all the classical music exams in the UK and elsewhere. These books might not be available where you are in the world. There might be something similar or something superior. I don't know, it's worth having a look anyway. This is essentially a guide to the nuts and bolts, the elements of music theory, both written and otherwise, put together by someone who comes from the classical music side of things, which has its own advantages and disadvantages. In this book, Eric Taylor covers rhythm and tempo, pitch, more stuff about rhythm, major scales, keys and clefs, groupings of notes and rests, some syncopation stuff, intervals and transposition, triads, and then other bits which might be useful about articulation, tempo, cadences, ornaments, things like that. So lots of useful stuff. Just have a quick flick through. It is very basic, but the way it's written is great because it clarifies things and it uses lots of different practical examples on how things are constructed and how things really work. There's lots of stuff on the major scale about accidentals, key signatures, etc. Not the most exciting book in the world, definitely not the most exciting, but does it cover the fundamentals in the necessary amount of depth? Yes. Is it easy to understand? Yes. There we go. There is a part 2, don't bother buying it, because it's full of things that you don't really need to know about unless you want to become an academic musician, which is, I think, a fairly horrible thing to be. Anyway, this is the textbook. This really comes in handy when you are working through a series of workbooks, music theory in practice, and these are for the music theory grades that the Associated Board puts out in the UK. These are the workbooks which enable you to take the exam. It's not really worth maybe taking the exam, but the first 3 grades of the workbooks are worth a look because they cover all the basic stuff about notation and these fundamentals that I've been talking about rhythm and pitch and things like that. So bar lines, time signatures, where things go on the stave. If you're learning to read, then this is a very useful thing. If you're learning to read, then learning to write will speed up that process immensely. Some key signatures, stuff about accidentals, stuff that you need to know that's like common knowledge. And then the way it works, it's a workbook. You have to fill in the answers. Again, some people might find this massively patronizing. Others will understand that they need a firm grasp of all the foundational elements of music, and nothing is too simple to be overlooked. People always want to skip ahead and focus on the hip shit, where they actually need to spend more time on the fundamentals. And if you just head to the most attractive and exciting sounding thing, all you're left with are gaps in your knowledge and therefore holes in your playing. So don't skimp on the fundamentals, on the boring stuff. So that's book 1, just to speed through. Book 2, same idea, but we're dealing with other time signatures, some different key signatures, groupings of notes and rests, intervals. It revisits every topic, every grade in a little bit more detail. As I said before, by the time you reach grade 3, the 3rd book, we're into 30-second notes, some more complicated key signatures, some transposition stuff, melodic minor, bear in mind that's classical melodic minor. It doesn't really change on the descending portion of it in contemporary music and in jazz. that's nonsense, but this is a classical approach to things. Anyway, grouping of notes in rest and compound time is something you definitely have to understand as a bass player. You have to understand how things work in 6/8, in 12/8, in 9/8, things like that. Scales and key signatures, major and minor. Worth a look. Anything above that, again, you're getting into more academic classical music territory, which may or may not, probably won't, be useful to you. Number 2 is The Advancing Guitarist by Mick Goodrick. Now, this is, without doubt, my favourite guitar book ever, and in fact, it could be my favourite book, full stop, because it's the polar opposite to most instructional books, in that there's no method per se. All that Mick Goodrick does is he presents a series of musical facts and concepts, and then highlights some things that are peculiar and unique to the guitar and to the bass, just, fretted string instruments in general. And it's up to you to provide your own method to work out how to practice the stuff and how it fits in with what you do musically. Now, some people will hate that, some people will love it. All that I know is that this book, more than anything else, really helped to solidify my understanding of triads, of seventh chords, and of modes. So here is my well-worn and thoroughly abused copy of Advancing Guitarist. Even before we got into the book, there's some absolute gold. Don't depend on anyone but yourself for your own musical growth. That's something that everyone should take on board. Anyway, this book is divided largely into 3 sections. Number 1, the approach, which deals with one note at a time, single notes. So you're looking at learning about scales and modes on a single string, then on 2 strings at a time, looking at intervals, and then once you've got out of horizontal playing, you get into vertical playing, into position playing, which is more practical, but your understanding of position playing is massively increased if you've done some work on horizontal playing, which a lot of people neglect. Part 2, he calls materials. Basically, we're talking about more than one note at a time. A lot of stuff to do with triads, seventh chords, and some more extended harmony. Now, not everything in this book is directly applicable to the bass, even if you have a 6-string bass. Some of this stuff about triads over different bass notes and slash chords is going to be very difficult to realise on a practical level on the bass. That doesn't mean you shouldn't study it. A great exercise would be to take this and put it on a piano or, hey, even a guitar, and understand different ways of voicing chords. Works wonders for your ears if you're used to hearing this stuff. And the only way you get used to hearing this, really, is if you play it yourself. So if you want to understand more about drop voicings, about slash chords, and about quartal harmony, this is really the thing. Even if you want to understand just about basic triads and such, this is the thing as well. Third part, they're really small essays that he's written, really insightful and some very interesting philosophical things about being a musician and playing music that I found immensely comforting. And every now and then when I read through it, I always find something new that I hadn't thought of or I'd forgotten about. And this is in spite of working from this book on and off for the past decade. So let's get through. Talks a lot about single string playing. Again, we're straight into modes straight away. So this is possibly a more advanced book. Derivative and parallel, just like I talked about. What he does in the first part is he gets you to record your own little chordal vamps, 1-chord vamps, for each mode, and then practice improvising on a single string against those chords, which is a wonderful thing to do if you want to get acquainted with the sound of each mode and the characteristic intervals and the things in that mode which are important. So in Lydian, it's definitely the sharp 4. That's where all the action is. The major 7 and the sharp 4. Those are the most interesting points of the Lydian mode. And playing on a single string really gets you to understand that in a lot of ways. It's also a really useful and interesting type of what we call restrictive practice. You learn a lot about your playing when you take away all your favourite patterns and licks and you're just forced to play melodies on a single string. Anyway, 1 string to 2 strings, lots of stuff about intervals. Again, this is as you'd expect from a guitar book. It's all in treble clef. Nutritious for bass players to get acquainted with the treble clefs. If you do all this stuff in all 12 keys, you will become an intervallic Jedi. Takes you through the same process with harmonic and melodic minor scales. Very useful once you've got the hang of the major scale. That in itself is a whole world of pain anyway. So part 2, materials, talks about different types of triads and discusses how they're basically just combinations of different major and minor thirds. Talks about how you can voice these triads differently, an important thing that bass players often overlook. This stuff is extremely painful. Looking at random combinations of different types of triads and then moving between them with the path of least resistance, voice leading, some practice cycles. These are the sorts of things that I actually use almost every day in my practice to make sure I'm not neglecting certain keys or I'm not biasing myself towards things that I find easier. Loads of stuff about seventh chords and voicings, again, not so much of a bass thing on the, harmonic playing them as chords side of things. Definitely stuff you need to know about. Loads of chordal stuff and some investigations into the harmonic and melodic minor scales. At number 3, putting the fun back into functional harmony, is Joe Hubbard's Functional Harmonic Concepts ebook. Now, it's all very well knowing about chords and scales and things like that, but unless you can put it on your instrument in a meaningful way, it's useless. And that's what this book does. It offers a systematic way of practicing and implementing all the stuff I talked about with regards to triads, harmonizing a major scale, putting chords through all their inversions, dealing with seventh chords, and understanding how and why harmony moves in the way it does. I only have this book as a PDF because when I bought it some years ago, it was only available as an ebook. I think that Joe has started producing physical copies of some of his books. I would always recommend buying a physical book rather than just using a PDF because it's easy for PDFs to just sit on your hard drive and not get looked at. Anyway, I'm not going to start screen grabbing portions of that book because Joe is pretty hot on copyright infringement, and more importantly, he's a very experienced jiu-jitsu and martial arts practitioner, and it's probably best not to piss him off. Anyway, here's a broad overview of what the book covers. Major and minor tonalities, harmonizing the major scale in triads, looking at triad inversions from the major scale all over the bass. Seventh chords built from the major scale. 2-5-1 progressions, major 2-5-1s. Common diatonic substitutions. He then takes those same things through harmony derived from the natural minor scale, the harmonic minor scale, and the melodic minor scale. Minor 2-5-1s. Substitutions in minor 2-5-1s. Combinations of 2-5-1s. He then looks at understanding extended chords, chord tensions, 9ths, 11ths, 13ths. He looks at common harmonic conventions like secondary dominance, extended dominance, tritone substitutions, and different patterns and combinations of 2-5s within standards. One of the best things that I think comes with this book, that other authors have neglected, I should add, is that Functional Harmonic Concepts comes with a set of MP3s with ear training examples, because the most important thing really with this is that you hear what you're doing. And Joe makes a very good point in a lot of his lessons when he says that 90% of ear training actually happens at the instrument. The only way that you get this stuff into your ears is by playing it a hell of a lot and getting used to those sounds, adding those sounds to your everyday musical vocabulary. Once he's covered the materials, he then puts them to use with functional harmonic analysis, basically looking at tunes and analysing what is going on a harmonic level so you understand how to learn them and how to play over them effectively. Now, in addition to looking at some pretty standards, he also looks at some more modern tunes which might appeal to other players. So, in addition to things like All the Things You Are, Autumn Leaves, and Days of Wine and Roses, you also get functional harmonic analysis of tunes like Bright Size Life, which is one of my favourite Matheny and Jacko tunes, and Spain, which is a sort of a fusion standard now. So it shows you both the materials, how to apply them to the bass in a meaningful and incremental way, and also how they sound, and also how you can apply them in a sort of academic way, how you can look at a new tune that you might get handed in a rehearsal or on a gig and pretty much instantly be able to navigate because you know the rules of the game. And that's an important thing. In at number 4, a book with a horrific title that's bound to put many, many people off, it's Jazzology. Now, this continues, or this is in a similar vein to functional harmony, but obviously it's not aimed at bass players, and as such it contains a lot of treble clef stuff, which you need to get to grips with. It's pretty thick, lots of knowledge in here, lots of work to be doing. So, brief overview of the content. Intervals, how to name them, how to alter them. Triads, seventh chords. Extended chords, upper structures. Scales and modes. There's some more esoteric stuff here as well. Bebop scales, altered scales, stuff that is important and does exist, but is not really a priority when you put it in comparison to understanding the major scale. 251s, how to analyze things in a harmonic way. Again, a lot of overlap with Joe Hubbard's functional harmonic concept, but explained in a much less bass specific way. That might be a good or a bad thing depending on your outlook. Similarly, there's a lot of stuff about piano voicings, piano comping in jazz. If you're looking to become a well-rounded musician rather than just another meathead bass player, then that could be a good thing to get into, I would say. Anyway, reharmonization, arranging techniques, how to approach improvisation, fundamentals of jazz, how to practice, very useful, often neglected. So, as the name would suggest, this is a book aimed squarely at jazz harmony. Again, you might see that as a good or a bad thing. What is great about this book is this stuff. End of every chapter, you have examples. Write the following intervals above the given note. Identify each interval as either consonant or dissonant. Pretty good. You could also identify the names of the intervals themselves. Again, lots of treble clef stuff, good for your general musicianship, not just being a bass player. So some of this stuff, as they get into it, is pretty dense straight away. Quite an advanced book, not for those who haven't got a firm grasp on the basics, but if you want to stretch yourself, and particularly if you're looking to get into more grown-up harmony, then this is definitely worth a look. In at number 5, I actually was not going to include this book on the list because I don't really think it's that great. I think it's overrated, but it's made the list because it's so popular and so well renowned that I think people will ask me about it even if I don't include it on the list. So it's in here because I wanted to give my 2 cents on it. And this book is the Jazz Theory book by Mark Levine. Now, why am I effectively being an idiot and suggesting that it's not that great when it has so many glowing recommendations and is so overwhelmingly popular? The reason is that it takes a lot of things from the perspective of the sort of Berklee College of Music chord scale theory perspective. Now, I've said before in part 1 of this, when we were talking about what you need to know, that I don't think scales are the best way into learning about music, especially on the bass. And if you're looking at improvising, I don't think learning scales is the way to go, because I think there's a tendency for players who practice a lot of scalar stuff, there's a tendency for their playing to be vague and sort of noodly, at least a noodling, without any sort of precise melodic or harmonic content. I think it's much better to pursue triads and 7th chords and that sort of vocabulary if you want your bass lines and your solos to be more coherent and more meaningful to the listener. Having said that, the Jazz Theory book is a really good reference. It's an excellent resource for checking your knowledge on certain areas that you might have forgotten about. If you're a teacher, it's a very useful educational resource. This book is massive. It's really dense in every sense of the word. Over 500 pages of jazzy wisdom for only $42. What a bargain. My copy makes it seem like I've used this book extensively based on the number of post-its in there. That's not the case. The sad truth is that I marked in a bunch of standards that I told myself that I would learn and then promptly avoided learning them. Anyway, that's my problem, not yours. Loads of endorsements from people who are very, very good at playing jazz, like David Liebman and Rufus Reid. This book covers just about everything you can think of. So, it's divided into 5 parts, 24 chapters in all. So the first part is chord scale theory, which I've said I'm not really a fan of, but that's my personal bias. You might be really into it, it might be helpful for you. It takes you through major scale, 2/4 progressions, takes you all through all the major scale modes, and then fairly swiftly goes through other parent scales, melodic, minor, diminished, whole tone. Tells you how to practice the scales, looks at slash chords. Fine. More scalar stuff in the playing the changes, the improvisation chapter, outside playing, pentatonics, rhythm changes, more stuff on how to practice, invaluable. How to reharmonize tunes. How to learn tunes, different heads. I think a really useful thing is talking about repertoire, which tunes you should know, which ones get called most of the time. Some other stuff about Latin jazz and some other bits. Some listening recommendations, which again are really welcome because not all books cover that. So if we get into it, chord scale theory talks about intervals. A good thing in this book is that for basically every concept he talks about, Mark Levine picks a musical example. So for all the intervals, he picks a standard, like Miles Davis's 4 or Parker's Confirmation, things like that. Johansson's Isotope. to illustrate how intervals are really used in a musical context. Fantastic. Again, you need to, most of the time, be reading treble clef, which is good for you. He talks about triads. He talks about inverting intervals. We've got some 2-5-1 stuff. If you have any sort of piano playing ability, then that will come in handy navigating these. If you don't, then you won't get the most out of this book. I certainly didn't. Stuff about 2-5-1s, harmonic analysis of 2-5-1s, cycle of fifths. And then we're into modes, chord scale theory, which, as I said before, I'm not really a fan of because it makes you noodly. Anyway, loads of stuff about modes, etc. So I'm sort of wading through this as quickly as possible, and I'd forgotten just how dense it is again. Diminished scale harmony, and he picks out little sequences and things like that. Again, loads and loads of knowledge in here. Tons of vocabulary, tons of information. Do you need all of this? Some of Art Tatum's piano voicings, simplified. Again, not really aimed at bass players, but if you worked on this solidly for a long time, it would probably do some wonderful things to your playing. It would probably do some wonderful things to my playing if I worked through it. How to practice scales. Again, this is what I hate. This is playing D Dorian, G Mixolydian, C Ionian over a 2-5-1 in C and expecting it to sound like music, which it really never does. Anyway, tons of stuff to work on. Some stuff that Herbie played. Fantastic. Good stuff to know. Is it better to just hear it on a record and take it down by ear? I would say so, but you know, however you get it into your playing is worth it. Some stuff on sequencing and improvisation. So, lots of good stuff, tons of wisdom, a lifetime's worth of work, definitely. Is it presented in the way that I like and that I think works well for the student? Not really. Is it a great educational resource? Is it very useful if you're a teacher? Absolutely. Do I use it to look up things that I should know and I might have forgotten? Yeah, quite a lot of the time. So, those are my recommendations of resources to help you become a less ignorant and more employable bass player. I should also point out that the most valuable thing you can do is, rather than buying books, get a lesson with an experienced teacher. It doesn't have to be a long series of lessons. The main argument that people make against having lessons is a financial one, that they can't afford it. And lessons with a decent teacher will not be cheap, but they will be much, much more effective in clearing up any confusion and getting out of bad habits than any amount of books will be. Even if it's just an hour in the same room as someone who knows what they're talking about, that can be hugely beneficial. And I would say that most of the breakthroughs that I've had in my playing and my understanding of music have come from those one-on-one situations rather than sitting and reading books.